Good morning. So I don't think all of our fellows are here. There must have been quite a night last night. I don't know, but they'll probably straggle in over the next hour or so. But I wanted to give us a head start and get us going on our first panel. We're going to be drilling down today after yesterday's really intense sessions at certain aspects of juvenile justice reform going forward. And one of the biggest issues, as I don't need to tell you, and it's not often talked about in terms of juvenile justice, is immigration. We're calling it, this panel, the Critical Challenges for Immigrant Youth. And we're really pleased to have as the moderator Angie Junck, who is a supervising attorney and a director of immigrant defense programs at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco. You can read her full bio in your packet, but not to lose any more time, I'll just turn the gavel over to her, and you can start.
Thank you. So my name is Angie, and I am joined by colleagues of mine. I'm just allow you to all introduce yourself in more detail later, but quickly, this is Laila Hlass she's the director of Experiential Learning and a professor of practice at Tulane University School of Law, and she has had extensive experience representing immigrant youth, including unaccompanied minor, for the last decade. And then we have Paige. She's a staff attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union, and they're in the heart of litigating immigrant detention issues and the criminalization of youth, particularly in Long Island. And then finally, we are joined by Cohen, the director of communications for National Center for Youth Law. And they are also in the heart of litigation around a case or a settlement we call Flores Agreement. And so he'll talk a little bit about that and why an organization that does a lot of youth work have focused on immigration issues. So our format is really to kind of each talk about some of the different issues that we see and want to have a discussion on some of them because many of us have seen different problems in different ways based on geography and not. But just to kind of center the conversation, the family separation border crisis has really catapulted this issue into the spotlight. Preceding that crisis, I don't know if people saw news coverage of what was called basically 1,500, quote, lost children in the immigrant detention system that was covered extensively. And this is something for a lot of us that have cared about this issue in juvenile justice and immigration. It's finally kind of exposing what I would call has been traditionally an invisible population to a lot of people in the United States, including within even the immigrant rights movement. Because in immigrant rights, we traditionally talk about the dreamers or people at DACA, but there are so many types of youth in the United States and their backgrounds. And immigrants live in our communities, so they naturally find themselves in local systems, whether it's the school system or, ultimately ending up in the juvenile justice system as well. And unfortunately, I've seen and tracked these issues for the last decade. We have seen many youth go through the juvenile justice system and be further criminalized. And right now, it's heightened criminalization that we're looking at. And just to give you some context for that, before I turn over to Laila to explain, who are these youth and where they come from and what is the experiences they have here, is that we have had a crisis in terms of mass migration from the Northern Triangle of Central America. In 2014 and 2016, we had record numbers of these, what we call unaccompanied minors, come to the United States, most of them alone. It was about 60,000 each year. So when people were talking about family separation, yes, there were numbers, but we're talking a couple thousand compared to 60,000 over the last couple of years that are living and going to school in our local communities. And what has also happened over time is it's grown massively. The system of immigrant youth detention and deportation has grown massively. So the system of immigrant youth detention called the Office of Refugee Resettlement Detention has basically grown 12-fold over a 10-year period. There's some numbers, I don't know, I don't have them off the top of my head, even from the last year have grown exponentially. And you have facilities that hold up at any given time. These are a little rare, but they're on the border, up to 2,000 youth in care, like congregate care. So they're using kind of some forms of confinement, incarceration that are rejected in many other places. And that's obviously led to significant abuse that you probably can see across the board, and you can Google that, and we'll talk about those cases as well. So what we're going to do is highlight some of the problems of the system and the criminalization. There's a lot of different forms of it. It looks like immigration detention. It looks like deportation. It looks like the school to prison to deportation pipeline of school resource officers directly calling ICE. But I think the important thing to know is this is not just a federal issue. This is absolutely driven at the local level of how schools, how law enforcement, how any other communities treat these young people, and they see them as a part of or not a part of these communities. In some places, it's really bad. They're using this as an opportunity to push young people out, and to be the face of like a new criminalization of saying, look, all these young people are MS-13 gang members, and we don't want them in our communities. So there's a lot for us in the immigrant rights movement to learn from the youth justice system in terms of criminalization, but we're trying our best to really kind of fight some of these attacks.
Okay, great. Good morning. I'm Laila Hlass. I'm an immigration law professor at Tulane, but I practice also in the Boston area, the DC area, started out in New York, actually. So have a sense of a few different regions. What I'm going to do is provide a little bit of background about how we categorize immigrant youth and some of the rights that attach, and what happens to a youth when they come into the country. So I'm going to talk about really broad picture about some of these issues and talk about some of the broad trends of criminalization and focus a little bit on the use of gang allegations in immigration proceedings. But hopefully some of these broad terms are going to set up for our kind of later, deeper, richer conversation. I did want to kind of go back to our introductory remarks and saying how grateful that we're here, that this panel is here, and that immigrant youth are being included in this conversation about juvenile justice, because I think often we're pretty siloed and don't kind of think broadly about immigrant youth's rights. And there's a lot to learn, because this language about gang allegations equating youth with all gang members, there's echoes, right, of the super predator myth that we heard about. And, you know, it's the language we've heard in the juvenile justice context about the state cannot proceed as if they're not children, right? Children are different. We don't have that really in the immigration system. Children really aren't accommodated in very many ways. They don't have right to counsel, although the Ninth Circuit may be revisiting this issue. So we'll see later this year, you know, what happens with that litigation. But they don't have. They're usually unrepresented right now in court. If you look at statistics. There are very few accommodations in immigration court, and the state basically, it's business as usual to proceed as if they're not children, they're just adults. Big picture, we are seeing that children are being detained in very large numbers, so with 13,000 unaccompanied minors right now. We're seeing that they're being held in detention longer. That amount has increased over time in the past few years. And we're also seeing that when they turn 18, unaccompanied minors are then transferred, right, to adult ICE detention. That happened to about 1,000 teenagers last year, according to some litigation that's come out. So that's the trajectory, is kind of more detention, longer detention, kids being put in adult facilities. Overall, in the immigration context, we've seen criminalization, this trend in the 90s. We saw kind of the rise of detention, for-profit detention centers, and just kind of skyrocketing numbers of immigrants being held in detention. At the same time, we saw increasing the ways in which contact with the criminal justice system could kind of push you towards deportation, ensure that you're going to be deported. At the same time, more and more collaboration between local law enforcement, formal collaboration, sharings of information with the immigration system. And so there has been this large trend of criminalization over the immigration system, and we see that trickling through with the way youth are treated. And one of the major ways is that I'm going to talk about is the use of gang allegations. And it comes from this rhetoric that we've heard, and it's kind of spread throughout the executive, that, Trump said, unaccompanied minors, they look so innocent, they're not so innocent. Sessions called them wolves in sheep's clothing. So it's, and there's kind of countless examples connecting that. But who are UACs? So unaccompanied alien children are unaccompanied alien minors. They're under the age of 18. They've been apprehended by immigration, by ICE or Border Patrol, and it's been determined that they are not with a parent or legal guardian. That's basically the definition. What happens to them after that arrest? They're supposed to be transferred to the Office of Refugee and Resettlement. This population, 95% of the kids, according to most recent statistics, are from the Northern Triangle. They're from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. About a third of them are 14 years old and younger. About 2/3 are between the ages of 15 and 17. They're mostly male. About 68% are male. 32% are female. That's grown. Years ago, it was closer to 20%, so it's becoming more female population that we're seeing fleeing from these countries. And once they're, once ORR has them, by law, they're supposed to release them to a sponsor if possible, unless there's a security kind of risk or that they can't find one. Because ORR in April agreed to hand over sponsors' information to ICE, we're seeing kids being held longer because sponsors don't want to come forward. And in recent testimony, we learned that dozens of sponsors have been arrested since this policy was put in place in April. So at the same time, ICE is then filing charges against these children in immigration court, and then they're having to appear in immigration court and defend themselves. So that's kind of the trajectory for those young people. Accompanied minors are young people who are found with their parents or a legal guardian under the age of 18. They don't go to ORR unless they've been ripped apart from their parents, like we saw this summer, but they are covered by the Flores settlement, which we'll talk about more in depth later. And so there are some minimum protections. They're supposed to be in facilities that are licensed to care for children by the state. And that's why we've heard a lot of language from the Trump administration attacking the Flores settlement. They've recently proposed regulations to try to do away with the licensing requirement because they want to be able to hold young people in unlicensed facilities for longer periods of time. And then kind of the last group of young people are just youth that are living in, immigrant youth who are living in the United States undetected by ICE. And it's a large number of young people. Migration Policy Institute has said 866,000 undocumented youth under the age of 16. Another, 1.6 million between the ages of 16 to 24, and that's going to be a lot more diverse in where people are coming from. They're coming from all around the world, and they are both. And then there are immigrant youth who are here who might have lawful permanent resident status, refugee status. And all of these young people are in danger of coming in contact with the juvenile justice system, which can then lead to deportation proceedings. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens. So what we've seen in the last few years is, in conjunction with this language trying to equate immigrant youth with gang members, is actual allegations being kind of lodged in immigration proceedings, which can then lead to young people being detained and deported. There's no definition, official definition under immigration law of what a gang member is. And so what we've seen is a single law enforcement officer, a single school official, a single immigration officer can slap a label on a young person because of the clothes they wear, because of what neighborhood they happen to live in, because who their family members are, because who they associate with, who their friends are, who they go to school with. And it can be taken as a fact in an immigration proceeding by the judge or by the adjudicator. And that makes it very likely they're going to remain in detention, and very likely they're going to be denied any discretionary forms of relief, like a lawful permanent residence, and they're going to be deported. So I saw this firsthand. I had a client that I'll call Jose, who was on his pathway to getting a green card. There was an incident at school where one student said that they heard from another student that he was in a gang. This was written up in a school report, and the officer said he saw Jose standing next to someone who admitted to being a gang member. Because of that, the school safety officer sent this report to a regional intelligence database, basically saying that he was a gang member or gang associate because of a third-hand rumor from one high school student and because the officer said he was standing next to someone in a gang. And this report, ICE got its hands on and then decided to detain him and put him in adult detention because he had then turned 18. Ultimately, an immigration judge, after being in detention for a year, an immigration judge ordered him deported because the judge decided that he was a gang associate. The other evidence against him was some pictures from Facebook where he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat, which they said was gang apparel. He was wearing the color blue, which was also his school colors. They said that was a gang color. So I did a study with ILRC, and I'll just end with kind of the major findings from that study. We talked to immigration attorneys, and their perception was gang allegations were on the rise. And we heard from attorneys from coast to coast, so throughout the country, in a number of major cities, they were seeing these allegations. And they were seeing them in different places in the immigration system. So they saw them in immigration court. They saw these allegations in USCIS, in the immigration agency. They heard them in asylum officer interviews. And often these allegations were no information, no underlying evidence was provided. It was just the allegation. ICE has found that this person is a gang member, a verified gang member, or it was very flimsy information. So.
That's a depressing note to hand over on. My name is Paige Austin. I work at the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is the New York affiliate of the ACLU. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the detention system that kids are a part of, which, as Angie and Laila have mentioned, is called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, in order to try to give a picture of what happens after these allegations attach to a child, just in terms of their detention. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is not part of the Department of Homeland Security. It's part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and they do not directly house kids. They contract with agencies, many of the same agencies that in whatever state you live in might hold children in the child welfare context or in any kind of congregate care context. Those organizations, those nonprofits, will be contracted by the Office of Refugee Resettlement to have a unit or two or sometimes hundreds of kids who are deemed unaccompanied minors and in federal government custody, but oftentimes right alongside kids who are in state custody. Here in New York, we have, I think right now, about 11 such facilities holding over 1,000 kids for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and that's out of a national population of about 13,000 kids in custody right now. The New York Times recently reported highest number of kids ever in immigration custody right now, and there are about 100 nonprofits nationwide holding kids. And as I say, here in New York, we have about 10% of them. So I'll start with an image, which I find to be very evocative. This system of immigration custody has different levels of supervision, not unlike kids in the juvenile justice system. There are a couple of facilities that are like locked jails, like with pods and cells. Then there's a mid-level of security called staff secure, which is kids are quite restricted in terms of their movements. Then you have kids who are in shelter care and kids who are in foster care. Kids get stepped up to these higher levels of supervision and kind of movement control based on the kinds of allegations that we're talking about. Someone has said that they're a gang member, or it could be that the child's expressed a desire to escape from custody, or it could be that they have mental health issues or behavioral issues that are causing them to act out. And so one of these care providers says that this kid needs more supervision. So the kid will go into staff secure custody or go into secure custody, which is the locked jail type facilities. And at that point, it's very, very difficult for the kids to get out. But let me go back to my opening image. We have here in New York one staff secure facility. It's located up in Westchester County at Children's Village, which is in Dobbs Ferry, New York. And I was there, I want to say in October, talking to kids in this facility. Now, these facilities are, this is not a locked jail facility, but it's a heightened supervision setting, and kids are extremely restricted. It looks like a house, but the doors are locked. They can't go outside except for very limited recreation time, which in some instances takes place in sort of a caged play area or field. And moving around inside the house, that literally children have to be with a staff member. They need to ask permission to go to the bathroom. They need to ask permission to go back into their room. They're literally like extremely confined in terms of what they can do. And everything they say and do is monitored and recorded and can be used against them. So I was there in October here in New York in this facility. And I remember I talked to one boy who was 16 or 17 years old who told me that he had been living with his mom on Long Island. He was already known to immigration. He was already in removal proceedings. And yet he'd gone through this system. He'd been placed with his mom and was living with her as the law requires while he went through the removal proceedings process. He got re-detained by ICE and put back into this system on the basis of a gang allegation that came from his school. And he told me that at his high school in Suffolk County, which is the east end of Long Island, there were no Latino immigrant boys left that he was aware of, that they had nearly all at that point been detained by ICE and put back into the detention system and been removed. And then he started talking me through in his high school who was in custody with him. And there were all these boys that he knew from his high school who were here in this setting, which is really unbelievable and visceral. And the thing that really makes it, so we're going to keep talking about enforcement, but once children go into this setting, like where I was interviewing him, it's extremely difficult to get out again. And the reason for that is that this, unlike the systems that you might be familiar with in juvenile justice or in the child welfare context, there's really no rules, standards, or court monitoring that goes into these children's release. Children are detained by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is required under law to promptly place them with a sponsor. What does that mean? What are the steps they're supposed to take to do that? What are the criteria to do that? What are the timelines for them to do that? To whom do they have to make a report in the way that ACS or a probation officer would have to make a report to a judge about what they're doing? The answer is there's no timelines, there's no fixed criteria, and there's no one to whom they have to report regarding the efforts that they're taking. And so kids, particularly kids who are being criminalized and accused of gang membership, can end up in sort of quicksand because the agency will say, we're not going to release them if we suspect they might be dangerous. But there's no criteria for what it means to be dangerous. There's no fixed way to evaluate that. And so we see kids like the boy that I interviewed going through successive interviews and evaluations by psychologists and psychiatrists. We see their families getting asked for documents that are, every document that's ever been generated by his school, prove he doesn't have a criminal record in his home country, now send us the school records again, asking that the family members all get fingerprinted, which, as Laila mentioned, is something that families often don't want to do because they're scared of immigration enforcement. Oh, well, now you got fingerprinted, but it's been 3 months, you have to get fingerprinted again. Okay, we need to visit your home, but now it's been 3 months, we need to visit your home again. We think that you should probably go to parenting class because this child previously became involved with a gang. We think this child needs to go to gang prevention classes before he can be released. We don't offer gang prevention classes, so 3 more months have just run off the clock, nothing's happened. It's truly another world. It's unbelievable that this system exists in the United States. So my office began litigating a case in February challenging the prolonged detention of children in this system. The ACLU of Northern California also brought a case last summer challenging the re-detention of kids, like the boy that I interviewed who had previously been released. And that case, fortunately, has been very effective at cutting down the number of children who are re-detained and put back into that system. But what we see is that children who are initially in that system, because they were picked up for the first time inside the United States or they were encountered at the border, continue to be held for very long periods of time. The case that we brought in February, which is a class action case on behalf of kids in New York State who have ever been in those heightened, like staff secure or secure custody, revealed when we got some discovery in April that those children had on average been held over 8 months and counting, even though about a quarter of them were trying to reunify with a parent, and the parent was, had their hand up and was ready to take the child in. Remember, the statute says kids should only be in this system if they don't have a parent available to care for them. So this is pretty incongruous and obviously very violative of parents' due process rights. And we also found 1 in 5 of those kids had been in custody over a year. Obviously, the end of the line here, and probably the intention, is that the kids will turn 18 and go into adult ICE custody, or that they'll give up and get deported. And so that's kind of the system that we're dealing with. And I would just make a pitch to everyone in the journalism world. We're in a period where we're very lucky to have the heightened attention and scrutiny on this system that's being paid now in the media. There's a serious lack of transparency, and I think the reporting that's getting done on that system and on the impact on kids and on what families are going through is amazing, and it's very helpful to attorneys, and I think it's hopefully going to be helpful politically. And so even though it's difficult to gain access and insight into what's going on or into the very devastating effects that this has on kids, we're grateful for the work that you guys are doing.
So I wanted to say a couple things after Paige. There was this many years ago, I said something, and it was a pitch to local law enforcement. We can make people disappear. And that's, their motto. They can actually tell people, if you don't want these youth or these people in your community, we can help make them disappear, and we're going to work together. And I think the bigger issue with some of this, too, is just the attrition. We know that young people, it's very hard to stay detained. When you're an attorney and you can't tell them when they're going to get out, it's like indefinite detention. The goal is for them to self-deport. We've had young people that actually, even before this crisis, had a way to get legal status in the United States and gave it up and said, I'll just get deported by myself, and were living by themselves in Mexico or whatnot, because they were like, how long am I going to be in detention for? You can't tell me when I'm going to get out. So we've talked about gang criminalization. We talked about immigrant detention. I wanted to focus on one area, specifically the school to prison deportation pipeline. And it's a really important thing to look at, because most of the stories, or even some of the focus of what people think about advocacy, has centered around the fear of young people going to school, because ICE may be at schools to raid them, deport them and their families. And while there have been some stories about that risk is much less than the real risk every day that school officials, including school resource officers, are working closely with local law enforcement or calling ICE themselves and reporting young people to be deported. And I'll just say one quick story, and I'll have Paige and Laila talk about what they've seen. But we worked on a pretty high-profile case out of Harris County, Houston. It has one of the largest school district police in the country. And a young person got in a school fight with another girl, went to the school resource officer to report himself and said, I just got in this fight with this girl. And they immediately handcuffed him. Didn't call mom, go to principal's office. And he was 18. This happened in January. He was about to graduate, in May. Was going to go to college, had a couple offers, and because he was 18, he was taken to the sheriff's office. They just took him directly to the sheriff's office. Harris County Sheriff basically cooperates very closely with ICE. They have the biggest amount of deportations in the country. He stayed there. He paid bond. They thought he was going to get out, but he went to an ICE facility, and he was transferred 3 times over 3.5 months. And the DA forfeited his bond, even though he had no choice but to go in ICE custody. They were like, you failed to appear, even though they turned him over. They continue to prosecute this young person for, assault. They're probably going to go to trial. Luckily, his school took him back towards the end and waived that time. He has an amazing career counselor that worked with him. It's been a really great intersectional campaign for people working on. But he still is facing deportation right now. They're trying to fight that case, but they're also trying to fight a criminal case, which you could imagine in immigration makes this much worse. And so these are the kinds of we're seeing this more often. These things have been happening, but we're seeing more of it in different places, and it's really important for us to focus on where some of these sources of criminalization are happening. So I don't know, Paige, Laila, you want to talk a little bit what that looked like in Long Island, or what else you might have seen?
Yeah, so I'll say two things. One is that because of the lack of court supervision of this process, there is often not even any way to figure out why ICE detained you or the basis of the underlying allegation against you, which is pretty insane if you think about it. You know, you could have kids sitting in custody for a long period of time, and there's some sort of interagency process preventing their release because they're perceived to be dangerous. But until they have a court hearing, they might not know who it was they were accused of standing next to, for example, or what it is that's caused this agency, ICE on the one hand, to pick them up, and then ORR to basically refuse to release them. And one thing that's been really powerful in the last year about the litigation, the Flores litigation, and then the Northern California litigation that's yielded some kind of small right to a hearing in immigration court, not usually a hearing that can result in your release, but at least some ability to get before an immigration judge, is that ICE has to now come forward with the basis of the gang allegation. And that can be very powerful because in many cases, the allegation is baseless. The lead plaintiff that we filed the case for in February was, like the other boy that I mentioned, living at home on Long Island with his mom, detained in July of 2017. ICE agents come to the home, take him out, handcuff him. Mom doesn't know who they are, doesn't know where he's gone. He vanishes. And she frantically calls everybody she can think of. She goes to the courthouse looking for him. She literally doesn't know in whose custody he is. She gets a call a couple days later that he's at one of these secure facilities, meaning a jail, but a kid immigration jail in Virginia. And thereupon, he sets out upon this odyssey. Now, they cannot get a hearing. His lawyer, he's an immigration lawyer, tries to get before an immigration judge. It takes until December. He's detained in July. It takes until December to get a hearing before an immigration judge. That would go to not even can he be released, but just is he dangerous or not? And this just is around where he's placed, in kind of what level of security. There were 2 pages produced by ICE to indicate that he was dangerous, and they alleged in those that he was a gang. The Suffolk County Police had said he was a gang member. He's never had any police contact. He'd been suspended from school the previous year for flipping off another kid. So that very clearly came from the school resource officer. And it also said he had gang tattoos. Well, he doesn't have any tattoos anywhere on his body. So finally, we get a judge who can look at this and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't think he's a gang member. But even that holding on the part of the judge doesn't have the ability to release him. And then there's another way that this can play out, which is that it says, for example, he admitted to being a gang member, and then you could have an immigration judge look at that and say, oh, I guess I'm never going to let him out of custody. So the two features of the system that I want to highlight are, number one, the just total lack of even ability to push back against these allegations because of the vagueness of them, but also the fact that there's almost like a amplifying effect in immigration, something that you would see in the juvenile justice context. Like this kid was once accused of, hanging out with gang members, for example. That might have one meaning in criminal court. It's amplified dramatically in immigration court because hearsay is permissible, because the judges are sort of risk averse, because the burden is on the non-citizen, unlike in criminal court where the government bears the burden of proof. And so for all these reasons, something that sounds very vague and very meaningless, and that in criminal court might not even result in charges, in immigration court is essentially amplified and can result in a person ultimately being kept in custody.
And I can just add, in the case that I was talking about, he was 18, so he was in ICE custody, so I requested a bond hearing. But they don't say what the basis why he's been re-detained after being released. I only find out in the bond hearing he's a verified gang member, according to ICE. That's what the prosecutor says. She then puts into evidence this boilerplate report created by a division of ICE called Homeland Security Investigations. Says, so-and-so provides some biographical details, is a verified gang member of MS-13, and then a boilerplate paragraph about what MS-13 it is, based on the following. the school incident report, the Boston police, and social media pictures, and I described the pictures to you. She tried to redact the number of the police report, the Boston police report, and so in that hearing, there wasn't, I kind of tore apart the pictures and tried to do that and say my client's not a gang member, but she wouldn't provide the underlying evidence, and so the judge took it as a fact and kept him in detention because he said it was a security risk. Later, I get the school report, find out what the basis is. Some kids said, and another kid said that he's a gang member, and I saw him standing next to another student who said he's a gang member, so therefore he's a gang associate. Never, no fight, no words exchanged, there was no discipline, but it was a report that was written up making these accusations. I could read through the redaction. I put it up to the light, got the police number, so got the police report. He was mistakenly identified as being involved in a crime. The police figured out he had an alibi. He was at work. They checked it out, and then he looked like the person who was eventually arrested. That's all it says. There's nothing about gangs in the report. There's nothing saying he's a gang member. All it says is he was wrongfully arrested and looked like this person who was arrested. And those sources and the Facebook pictures of him wearing very popular clothes, Chicago Bulls hat, Nike Cortez shoes, that's the basis of the gang allegation. But, at the hearing for the green card, the judge, I actually subpoenaed the school officer, and the school officer really believed he was a gang member, and he said he's always hanging out with gang members, he's and gang associates, and it's like, well, what do you mean? He eats lunch with these young people, and somebody there is a gang member, and they're all gang associates because they're next to him, and so then everyone becomes a gang associate. They go to the same classes. Did they have weapons together? No. Did they, harm some other student together? No. They're just literally in the lunchroom, and I've identified one person as a gang member, so they're all gang associates. And that was persuasive to the immigration judge, and so he denied the green card based on discretion because he found he was a gang associate. So I think that kind of amplifies what you're saying.
Yeah. I can just, I just don't want to undermine. I know this immigration system is crazy, horrible, but the power that local officials have and school officials have to call someone something or to just tell ICE, which is, they're just reckless. They'll take anything they can get, and they don't have to prove things often in court. It's astounding, but that's why sometimes we're still really focusing on that local level and that gateway, because once again, in immigration, not everyone has NICLU and others to litigate their cases out of this to get the bond hearing. So we'll turn it over. Louis, do you want to also use that mic? And
try that?
Yeah.
Sounds like it's hot? Yeah, okay. Good morning. My name is Louis Cohen. I'm the Director of Communications at the National Center for Youth Law. I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to talk about context and narrative, some terrain I feel more comfortable on. The National Center for Youth Law works on a range of issues involving systems that involve children. And we are co-counsel in a case that was referenced, Flores v. Sessions. When we got involved, it was Flores v. Meese. So maybe that's even beyond some of your memory, but it gives you a sense of this case has been going on since 1985. So the government's always had difficulty in working with immigrant children. We got involved because we have done a lot of historical work around reforming child welfare systems. And at the time in 1985, the government had no way of dealing with immigrant children in detention. And so what was happening was unaccompanied children were being detained with unrelated adults. In the case of our named plaintiff, Jenny Flores, it was literally an old motel, one of these U-shaped motels where they strung a fence across the front of it and just had the children and adults in this motel. And so our involvement was to get in and try and say, first of all, as a child welfare principle, children should first be with their families. So the Flores settlement says the preference is for release, ideally to parent, but, and this is really important for the way the narrative is going, Flores says they should be released to other family members or to an adult designated by the parent. And the significance of this, Angie had said that the separation issue has catapulted this issue into everyone's consciousness. Unfortunately, that's a two-edged sword, because we now have this perception that separation means you're ripped from your parent at the border. But in the case of Jenny Flores, her mother was in the country already, and the idea was to get her released technically to her aunt, who had legal status. But my point is, we have all these children who are being separated from other family members, and I don't see a moral distinction between keeping children in custody when they could be with their aunt, or even the idea of separation doesn't apply to you come with your older brother and they separate you. So the whole focus on the family separation has sort of masked something, in my opinion, much larger, which is this has become a system for the criminalization of all migrant youth, and it's to justify a system of mass detention. So in December of last year, there were 7,500 children in immigration custody. Now there are roughly 13,000. So you can see there's a rapid increase. And this is happening because many of the elements of the Flores settlement are not being lived up to. And this is the idea that this fingerprinting barrier has been erected to keep sponsors from coming forward to take the children. But that's only a tiny part of it. In order to be released, because of the passage of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, federal TVPRA, there was a sense that there needed to be good vetting of any potential sponsor who would take these children out of custody for fear that they might be trafficked. As far as I can tell, this is almost solely based on one case in Ohio where 8 children were labor trafficked, put to work on an egg farm. But it's a good practice. You know, you shouldn't release children to adults without being sure who they are. So there's this process of of home visits to make sure that these homes are appropriate before the children are released. Well, this has just become a pretext now for how not to release children. So, for example, you've got children who the government will say, well, the neighborhood's not good enough. It's not safe to release the children to, so we're going to keep them in custody. In other words, they're criminalizing poverty. We're not really expecting a lot of these immigrant families to be living in well-to-do neighborhoods. And so that's just one example. One of the most egregious that I know of is we had a detainee who is deaf, and the government said, well, we can't release you to your mother because she doesn't know American Sign Language. Well, nor does this child. So again, it's an example of the kind of pretexts that are being used to make detention indefinite. I was just mentioning one of the funniest, funny is a strange word to use, but the government has told everyone that until recently the average stay in detention was 56 days. Well, we learned that the way they calculate that is they only calculate the average stay based on children who've been released. So in other words, if all the ones who've been in detention for long periods of time, if they're still in detention, that doesn't count against the average. So you can kind of see the game that's being played here. We have named plaintiffs in some of our current cases who've been in for 4 years. Which brings me to one other really important part of the narrative. when the government began to challenge the Flores decision, and there's both legislation in the Senate as well as these new regulations, as well as they actually went to court to try and modify the settlement. Everyone had this focus on what was called the 20-day rule. So I want everyone to know there's no such thing as a 20-day rule. Unfortunately, that created the perception that no children were being held longer than 20 days, contradicted by the government's own average. But that's a reference to how long in times of, quote, emergency, children can be detained in unlicensed facilities. So in 2015 or in 2014, when a previous surge of families were coming from the Northern Triangle, the Obama administration tried to set up family detention. The problem for them was that these facilities were not licensed by the state, and the Flores settlement, trying to use the good principles of child welfare, said they had to be facilities licensed by the state to house children in congregate care. Government has never set up such a facility, one in Pennsylvania that is questionably meeting the standards, but it holds a minimum number of kids. So the Obama administration started setting up these family detention centers holding children. The Flores Council challenged that, and the finding was during a time of emergency, if the average stay in an unlicensed facility is 20 days, that's okay as long as they move them on to licensed facilities after 20 days. So it was a rough standard by the Ninth Circuit. It wasn't an actual rule of any kind. However, it's become a vernacular that children are only being held for 20 days. So I really want to disabuse everyone of that notion. Children are being held for months and years. And now this facility in Tornillo, Texas, has gone from 1,000 to 3,400 kids. There's a proposal for 2 military bases to house 15,000 kids at each. So you can see the government is gearing up for mass incarceration of children, and it's doing it in a system that you've heard described that doesn't have the protections of the juvenile justice system. The last thing I just want to touch on, which is slightly separate from what I've spoken about so far, is once children are in custody, there's a variety of means to detain them longer. And one of the most creative ways that the government has gone about this is the misuse of mental health diagnoses. So these children are coming from Central America, dire conditions. They're bringing a lot of trauma with them. The experience of coming here, of being detained, is all traumatic. They're in these facilities, and they're children. So not surprisingly, some of them act out. The government then says, oh, you have a mental health problem. Now we're going to send you to a more secure facility, which is even more traumatic. We're going to give you often psychotropic medications to make you docile. And then we're going to say, you can't leave until you're cured, and we're going to determine when you're cured. So we've got something, it's not a stretch to say, kind of analogous to East Germany during the Cold War, of using mental health as a way to imprison people indefinitely, in this case, children. So just want to leave you with, it's really important to view what's going on as much larger than what has been defined as separated children. I mean, it drives me crazy every day when I read these pieces that say there are 111 children still in custody. No, there are 13,000 children currently in custody. That's doubled in less than a year, and the plans are for that to get much larger.
Well, on that note, yeah. I mean, as bleak as this is, though, I think it's been great, though, to have all the litigators involved. There's definitely been wins and litigation actually trying to, I mean, before people would be like, there's no bond hearing. You can't even have a hearing to get out of these jails. But it's like people have actually forcing now to actually have some transparency and procedure around this. And just one thing that I guess was related to what you said, Lewis, is oftentimes we see these therapists in these shelters, inducing the young people to be like, let's talk about your problems. But they're used as forensics. They're literally extracting information from these young people about themselves to self-incriminate themselves, including their family. And then that information is not confidential. It's turned over to ICE that's used to prosecute them in immigration court and deport them. So it's this thing, it's like, oh, you want to really try to help them, but you're not helping them. So given our time, I mean, we can keep talking about these issues. We want to really open it up and have more time for questions. So we'll leave it open to whoever wants to ask something.
Of course. Do you want me to stand up or okay, sit? Okay. Good morning. My name is Jimena Alvarez. I work for KENS 5 in San Antonio, Texas. I'm the research specialist for the station, and I have a segment in Spanish as well. I highly concentrate on immigration, and my question is for Laila. With this school resource officer, I hate to ask this question, but what was their ethnicity?
Yeah, he's a white officer.
So that's what we're seeing more often. So these resource officers have the authority to report to immigration their status of a student, just based on stereotype.
Yeah, and so, there actually was fallout from this case. I don't know about the school resource officer, but there was litigation because information was shared, and actually the Boston superintendent of schools did resign. But yeah, exactly. Like there need to be school policies, and a lot of schools don't have just like explicit policies about the role of school resource officers in law enforcement. And I think that's a really important point. But there are privacy laws, educational privacy laws that were being violated.
So these school resource officers, are they being informed the status of the student prior to the incident?
No. So to my knowledge, the school resource officer didn't know the immigration status, but reported his investigatory notes to a regional database, to like the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. It's like one of these fusion databases created after 9/11 to like collect lots of information regionally about terrorists and gang members.
If there was an unaccompanied minor in school, would the resource officer or staff be knowledgeable of their status?
I mean, they're not supposed to, people are not supposed to have to report their immigration status to schools, and so that's not supposed to be shared. Certainly, it can be figured out sometimes, and that information can be known, might be known to officers. And certainly, when students try to register, schools ask for school records. If they may see that they're from other countries, they may say, I don't have it because my records are from this other country. So there may be guesses about their status from school officials.
And would you say this is a rise due to the Trump administration?
Yeah, so I guess just in terms of gang allegations, Obama identified gang enforcement as an immigration priority. So we saw this happening. There are cases of this happening prior to Trump. What we've seen since Trump is kind of really targeted rhetoric. And there's actually this great UCLA study like analyzing Trump's tweets and speeches for kind of like larger themes around immigration. And one of the themes that's very clear is unaccompanied minors, gang members. There's fact sheets about it on the White House page. There's statements from Health and Human Services. There's statements from all sorts of people within the executive, aside from Sessions and Trump, calling unaccompanied minors gang members and saying there's this connection. So we know that's the case. And then in tandem, it does seem to be a rise of using gang allegations in immigration proceedings.
I could just say, too, the lack of policies around this and conversations, like Houston Independent School District, all the trustees were like, we didn't even understand how our HISD police work. We couldn't even figure out who we were supposed to talk to, who was in charge. Obviously, the superintendent left, came here to New York City, but they washed their hands of it. They basically were defending the whole thing. They said, well, we found protocol, the principal did what they did, and they didn't know what was happening. So unfortunately, that's what's happened. And these kids end up in those situations, and they're like, we don't know what we were supposed to do.
Yes, Christian Jaime, Bay Times. Pretty sure I know the answer to this, but none of these SROs underwent any sort of cultural competency training?
So yeah, in my case, definitely not cultural competency training, and also not training on gang protocols. So I actually had gotten through other means protocols from the Boston police about how they make gang identifications, and I questioned him, are you familiar with this protocol? Officer says no. Do you know what the criteria are? No. Do you know how many criteria before you're actually able to say that someone's a gang member? No. So he had no training in what he was doing, not even cultural competency, but in gang identification.
Hi, I'm Masara Makati with the Houston Chronicle. 2 questions for you guys. First of all, obviously you've pointed out all these flaws in the immigration system. I was wondering if there are any states, counties, cities that you see those flaws are really amplified or heightened across the nation. And then my second question is, you had mentioned this actually, obviously access to reporting immigration is something that can be really difficult. If there are any tips that you have for us on how we can better access people that are affected by the system or just better report on the topic.
So I'll start. Houston is a problem. It's a major problem. They have the second most deportations in the United States, and you have a mayor that continues to say that he welcomes immigrants. You have a sheriff that says, they just wash their hands because of state law. But they're actually passively allowing all of this to happen where they're turning over people. And HISD, if you investigate any of the HISDs, which is a mess over there, they're just washing their hands of it. They basically have criminalized this young man, Dennis, and kept saying, well, it was his fault that he got in the school fight. These are the repercussions of what happens when you get in a school fight. Now you can get deported to Guatemala, So those are, that's one area, but it's around the country. It depends. And that's the issue is a lot of people don't know what's going on because no one asks until we get to these situations like Dennis when they're deported, or Long Island has become apparent now because Paige is seeing all the people in the detention. About 10 years ago, I was working with Office of Refugee Resettlement, doing some training with them, and they start showing me numbers. And had a person that was working in Vincennes, Indiana, on detention. They were like, we have 42 beds here. 40 of those beds come from Orange County, California. So we went back to Orange County, and we started digging up things. As they basically paid someone full-time for the probation department to report youth to ICE. That was their full-time job. No one knew what was happening. It was just, you just started to see that. So, there's a lot of different places, and it changes. Arizona is like ground zero for a lot of this information sharing. But, it's even places that seem really progressive. Like California, we were reporting the most amount of use. San Francisco, 10 years ago, there was a whole story, many stories about this issue.
I just want to add 2 things. Number one is, the mechanism by which schools are cooperating with ICE remains very underexplored and underreported. NYCLU and Latino Justice, another organization here, last summer filed state law Freedom of Information Act requests to get at how in Suffolk County those SROs are cooperating with ICE. Because, the obvious thing is, okay, there's an SRO in the school. The SRO is a police officer. We know the police department cooperates with ICE, so presumably that's the chain. But is, for example, the school administrators, to your question, are the school administrators offering information to that SRO? Are the school administrators, maybe even without the SRO, contacting the police department or ICE? The truth is that on Long Island, where a huge number of kids are being detained, we don't know. And when we filed the Freedom of Information Act request, we filed it both to the school district and to the police to try to get the protocols through which they cooperate, and neither answered. And both of those Freedom of Information requests are now getting litigated in court by our office and by Latino Justice. And so this is like an area where I look out at all of you and I'm like, yes, let's figure this out, you know, because I think that the precise mechanisms are extremely opaque, and the schools are working hard to hide them because I think that they are interfering with children's right to education, and so they are really, really closed in terms of disclosing, you know, that process. And I just wanted to make a point on your second question: how do you access kids? I, as excited as I am with the journalistic interest in this area, I have to say we get calls like all the time from journalists who are like, "Can I have a kid? Can you introduce me to a kid? Can I interview a kid?" And we work with a bunch of kids who literally the number right now who are willing to talk to journalists is 0, and that is with good reason. These families in New York, I can say, I mean, I've worked in immigration for years, and these are the most scared families that I have worked with because they are between ICE, the local police, and then also the gangs. You know, to the extent that there is gang presence either here or in Central America, if you have a family saying, you know, I'm not MS-13 or whatever, they're scared of everybody. And, I like sat in living rooms where like the kid comes home from school and rings the doorbell and everybody jumps. Like that's how scared people are. They're petrified. And so unfortunately, we get all these calls from journalists. Can I talk to a kid? Can I talk to a kid? And the answer is no, you can't talk to a kid. And so I put that to you guys as a challenge to say, number one, it's going to be harder than that, at least here in New York. You're not just going to be able to call up an organization, get a referral, and go out and get, you know, the anecdote. It's going to take more, I think, relationship building and time in the communities to try to make those connections. And then I would also encourage everybody, I know that that's how stories are supposed to look, is like, you know, the anecdote followed by the stats. But it would be great for people to figure out ways to cover this that don't put kids and their families out there, you know, and because I think that that's really difficult and it's dangerous for them. And so I would welcome creative solutions.
I wanted to add one thing just about thinking about the school to deportation pipeline, because this is a really important point that Paige is talking about. We don't know how ICE is sharing information, schools are sharing information with ICE, and it's important to figure that out. There's a much larger kind of like everyday issue of school to deportation pipeline that we should also be thinking about that's like less dramatic than the direct call to ICE. And I just want to make sure that that's really clear. Children are over policed, like particularly children of color and immigrant children in kind of all aspects of their life. And so when there's a increased police presence in schools, they're, you know, more likely to be arrested, right, or to have some kind of incident that's going to get reported. And if they are arrested, even though they may not immediately be detained and put into removal proceedings, that sticks with them. And so you have to report to immigration when you're seeking some kind of benefit if you've ever been arrested. And then you have to provide the documentation about that stuff. So any kind of contact with law enforcement, with juvenile justice, that follows these immigrant kids everywhere and can ultimately lead to them getting denied protections that were created to assist them, and then that leading to their deportation. So it's much broader. The school to deportation line is much broader than schools calling ICE and kids getting picked up. It has to do with children being in the crosshairs of a very aggressive immigration enforcement regime and over-policing in schools and just in their daily lives. And the interaction between those institutions means it much more likely for them to eventually be deported and detained.
Yeah. And Louis, and this is all by design. This is all purposeful, right? The intersectionality of this is really purposeful, and that's why a lot of us are really fighting to really have more intersectional fights with folks, because we're losing young people because of like how they're criminalizing on the front end, and there's very little we can do at the back end. So, Louis? Sure, okay.
Yes.
You can answer.
Sorry. I'm LaTanya Russell-Humes. I'm a board member of an advocacy organization in Westchester County. And one of the questions, you commented that the goal is to really continue to detain kids. And I'm trying to figure out what's the end goal. Is the benefit of keeping them there longer is that it's easier to eventually deport them as adults? Or what other, if there's something even more nefarious than that?
It's a strategy of attrition. The whole goal of Trump's administration wasn't that they're actually going to physically remove 12, 13 million documented people. It's to create such fear and use examples of certain people that they all just are like, oh, we're going to self-deport. And unfortunately, it does work.
And I would say, people give up their hope, and so then they kind of give up rights that they have and give up applications, and then they end up deported. But also just being detained makes it much more likely you're going to not have access to counsel and that you're going to be deported. The statistics are really kind of insane if you look at them, and access to justice immigration court. So, having an attorney in some instances has been shown to kind of be 14 times more likely you're going to win your case. And when you're detained, you're much, much, much more likely not to have an attorney, and so it acts that way too.
Yeah, I'm curious if of the 13,000. Oh, my name is Charlotte West, and I'm a Denver-based freelancer. I'm curious what percentage of kids in detention were caught at the border of the 13,000. What percentage of those kids were caught recently, and then how many of them have been in the United States for several years who might otherwise be qualified for DACA, for example?
That's a good question. I'm not sure we can answer it. So the data on all of this is very limited. As Flores Council, we're just about the only folks who are entitled to some information about all kids in immigration detention, but we don't get any information about where they were apprehended. So we have a spreadsheet that tells us where they're from, approximate age, how long they've been in custody, and the type of facility they're in. But it doesn't tell us how many are border apprehensions. I believe the bulk of them are border apprehensions. But
yeah, so ORR keeps data, and I think they may have, they don't say where they were arrested, but they have data on their website, and they may have data about the length of residency of people, but I would say vast majority. Border Patrol also keeps data on the number of children, unaccompanied and accompanied children who've been arrested. So you can kind of like roughly compare how many kids were arrested and like look at the kids in detention. It's not a perfect match, but you'll see that the vast majority were likely recent arrivals that are in OR custody right now.
And there are some definitional issues about that around how proximity to the border. So I think it's 50 miles actually counts as at the border.
Okay, another question?
Del Wilbur, the Los Angeles Times. If I'm hearing you guys correctly, you're saying that, I'm just trying to sum up your argument about, or not argument, but your position on this, is that the unaccompanied minors are definitely preyed upon by gangs. I mean, that happens. And they join some of these gangs, but your point is that they're just such a small number that it distorts, and they're being used for political purposes, and it distorts the larger issue. And I'm wondering if there need to be better controls, because I covered some cases involving MS-13, for example, out of Boston, and of the 8 cooperators the government used to break up this gang in Boston, 6 were unaccompanied minors who came. They had no supervision really at home, and for various reasons, they joined this gang, which you could argue how important and successful MS-13 is, I suppose. They're kind of a bunch of, as I said, my story, boneheads. They're not going to be this big problem. But I'm just wondering, like, how do you, one, cope, if they switch the policy, do we do things better to ensure they don't get sucked into this life? And 2, that it's just they're a very small number. Right.
Well, I'll just say, and I'd love for you guys to answer this. There was a great article that was yesterday. I'll try to see the source. I can share it later on. It was from a law enforcement officer himself saying this whole idea of MS-13, that it's growing, it's fearful, is not based on evidence. It's actually undermining law enforcement efforts. And the fact that they're trying to force, like, even MS-13, they're like, no, we have other issues in some of these localities. It's just this narrative of, like, creating a culture of fear in which then people are like using it to justify deportation. That's not to say that gang issues and MS-13 aren't real, but I mean, these are complicated issues at the local level, and you look at the numbers, and these young people, they have some family that are legal status. They have people are here, and let's think of this. It is really an international crisis. I mean, we deported gang members from Los Angeles that now are coming here. So it's very complex, and a lot of these young people are both victims and have been part of it. I mean, Long Island is one of those examples. So.
If I could, we have one more. I want to move as many questions as we can as possible in a limited amount of time. So if I can get one more person to ask, and then you can respond as well to the earlier question.
Hi, I'm Art Levine with the Juvenile Justice Information Exchange. Also wrote a book that quoted your organization for overdrugging, Mental Health Incorporated. What is your advice? Center for Investigative Reporting, Reveal, did a piece about the overdrugging in one facility. What is your advice for exploring the range of abuse of mental health kids, disorders in terms of overdrugging, overdiagnosis, indefinite thing, your suggestions for reporters who want to follow up on that, and you probably could figure out by reading the Reveal thing, how did the guy get the story initially? I mean, so just give some pointers for reporters who'd like to follow up on this abuse of the system.
The first place I'd start is I would look carefully at the filings in two cases, both motions to enforce the Flores settlement, because there are a whole bunch of declarations on the issue of over-medication in the facilities, and also Lucas R. v. Azar, which is our new, what we call Flores 2. It's a parallel case, also focused particularly around the due process rights of children not to be over-medicated. The Reveal story centers on Shiloh, which is a residential treatment center in Texas. This is somewhat ground zero, but there's also a facility in New York that's similarly a major issue around the over-medication. So looking at what's going on in those two facilities is where I would concentrate. What's the name of one of yours? Mercy First in New York. Yeah, right. We filed a motion to enforce Flores on April 16th of this year that has 30 declarations, sworn declarations from children on their over-medication. That's a really good place to start. That also to the question about how do you find sources on this. These declarations are a good way to get the children's stories without being able to interview them directly. One last thing I want to say on this, advice for journalists on this. Maybe some of you saw Caitlin Dickerson's piece in the Times last week about the kids being transferred to Tornillo in the middle of the night. And the way she got that was talking to the social workers who work at some of these facilities. There are 100 facilities where immigrant children are being detained. A lot of them are staffed by child welfare professionals who are horrified by what's going on. And that is, I think, a great resource both for the psych meds angle and general reporting about kids in immigrant detention or some of these adults who see their professional ethics being violated and are willing to come forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make one other point to the gentleman from the LA Times on the gang membership. First of all, yes, I think it's many fewer kids. Second of all, the definition of gang members is being, expanded to mean proximate or friends with, as opposed to having gone through some sort of membership process. But a third point I'll make that's very fascinating to me is that I was told by an organization that does gang prevention on Long Island that detaining kids longer, which causes immense psychological harm, makes them more vulnerable to gang recruitment or proximity upon release because they're a mess. They've just totally become depressed. They become separated from family. Their ties are diminished. And so I think that the solution here is wrong as far as, keeping kids in custody indefinitely. So now we're releasing kids who've been locked up for a couple years into the community.
Yeah. So we have to, We have to wrap up, but we're like really grateful to have this opportunity. There's not that many opportunities to talk to different spaces about these issues and the intersection of them. Despite the bleak picture, I think there is tremendous opportunity. I mean, just the outrage that came around the family separation, I've never seen that in my 15-year career in immigration. But the coverage of these issues is so important. It's actually driving advocacy, and a lot of people that are on the ground that want to do something are reading and looking at what are the issues and what should we do about them. So thank you for covering it.
So this was an incredibly absorbing but also depressing panel. But I really want to thank Angie and the panel for bringing us at least close to it. I'm sure they'll be available for the next 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back to work. Thank you very much.